My name is Jamison Boley. I'm a first-year NPSIA student in the conflict analysis stream. I'm a JDMA student, so I do a joint degree at the University of Ottawa as well. So today I presented a paper using Ted Gurr's theory of relative deprivation and attempting to apply it to the conflict in the Ukraine. So this was a paper that I wrote for the class Conflict and Development with Professor Dodalin. And essentially you take a theory and you try and make it, help it explain a conflict. So the theory of relative deprivation is looking at the discrepancies between the ought and the is. So looking at perceived discrepancies, and the focus on this theory and why it's so interesting is because it's based on qualitative data as opposed to quantitative data. So while it's really hard to get good empirical data on it, it's quite interesting because it's based on perceptions rather than facts. And applying it to the Ukraine, I found that his theory of aspirational deprivation is most convincing in explaining the outset of that conflict. So that's the idea that as the state capabilities remain the same, that the expectations of the collective increase, and that discrepancy between them then triggers a model called the frustration-aggression model. And it's the idea that if frustration meets a sufficient intensity and scope, that it triggers aggression. And I used that to attempt to explain to the Euromaidan protests and riots, and ultimately acted as a catalyst for the broader conflict in Ukraine. I think that there have been lots of explanations for the Ukrainian conflict, and indeed lots of them are important for various different aspects, specifically those of regional security, hegemony, great power politics, those kinds of things. But this is something that I haven't seen in the literature before as applied to Ukraine. So I really wanted to delve into that a little bit and to look at the individual perceptions and to see how those differed from what the state was able to provide, specifically because the state did such an unexpected turn. And so I think this theory really fits to explaining that initial kind of outbreak. I thought about expanding my paper further. I had some great feedback and comments by the other panelists. So what I'm thinking of looking into is using relative deprivation theory and also looking at Eastern Ukraine, so looking in the Donbass regions, looking at the pro-Russian rebel groups and seeing if that theory can apply to their aggression as well. But that would look a little bit different. So instead of moving away from the EU, it would be their perceived deprivation that would come from moving away from Russia. So that's certainly something that I would look into as well, and also looking at kind of taking a step back from relative deprivation theory and looking at the broader picture and kind of proposing some different alternative explanations just to get a bigger picture of the conflict in and of itself. I think that theory is very useful in guiding practice, and certainly practice is always going to be a little bit different, but it helps when you apply theory to these different situations, specifically that of Ukraine. You can get a better understanding of how to deal with the conflict in itself. So when you look at the relative deprivation theory, the policy implications for that would be to either increase state capacity or decrease the perceived expectations. So those are two things that we can look at. Those are two in practice tangible things that we can look at, that the theory says, okay, if we decrease one or increase another, that's going to reach an equilibrium and that will decrease the violence. And indeed, we have seen that start to happen in Ukraine. We have seen state capabilities increase slightly, and we have also seen the collective value expectations decrease. So it is interesting to see it working out in practice as well.